Throughout the meal, they kept talking about the investment deal they were about to sign, a $40 million project, hailed as the breakthrough that would propel Anderson Holdings onto the international stage. Massive figures, complex financial jargon, long-term strategies, they tossed them around nonstop, as if to make one thing clear: this was a playground for the powerful, not for someone like me. Then, when the conversation began to stall over a shortage of working capital, I quietly spoke up. "I can help." I said I was ready to provide financial support so the company could get through the difficult phase. My father leaned back in his chair and shook his head with open disdain. "We don't need your pocket change," he said, his sarcasm slicing straight through my pride like a blade. My mother smirked, her eyes cold as ice. Then she delivered the line that silenced the entire room. "This is a $40 million business. Who do you think you are to help?" Every word, every look, felt like a slap across my face. In that moment, I felt so small. I might as well have been invisible, as if all my effort, all those years of trying, had been erased by a single contemptuous laugh. My siblings sat around the table, silent. No one spoke up for me. Some lowered their heads, avoiding my gaze. Others turned away, as if afraid to meet my eyes. Their silence hurt even more than the mockery, because it told me one thing clearly. In their eyes, I had never been enough to matter. I swallowed hard, forcing down the surge of emotion rising in my chest. I knew that if I reacted, if I argued, I would only look more out of place, more pitiful, in my own home. So I chose silence. I quietly stepped back, taking a deep breath to keep my voice from trembling. On the outside, I appeared calm. Inside, my self-respect was shattering into pieces, and in that moment, pushed to the very edge, a silent decision began to form, a decision that would overturn everything they believed to be certain. The air in the room remained heavy after the ridicule. I moved to a chair near the window, staring out at the empty yard as the last light of evening slowly faded. The gray sky outside mirrored exactly how I felt inside. My parents' words kept echoing in my head, each syllable drilling deeper, reminding me of my place in this family. The outsider, the excess child, the one who was never good enough to be acknowledged. My mother continued speaking at length about expansion plans, about multi-million-dollar deals waiting to be signed, as if determined to prove that my presence at this meeting was entirely unnecessary. My father nodded in agreement, occasionally adding a sarcastic remark, turning everything I had said into a joke. They repeatedly emphasized that the company had stood strong for decades, that their network of partners was powerful enough to never require petty assistance from me. Each sentence was like a blade, slow but precise, cutting into whatever pride I had left. I sat there, listening, studying each familiar face, and suddenly realized a brutal truth. They believed they had absolute control. They had no idea that behind the glossy contracts, behind the massive cash flow sustaining the entire system, there was a name they had never bothered to notice. A name they had always underestimated. And it was that very arrogance that had made them blind. In that moment, all the hurt and resentment suddenly settled, replaced by a chill so sharp it was almost frightening. I no longer wanted to explain myself. I no longer craved their approval. Instead, a clear plan began to take shape in my mind, step by step, slow but certain, a plan strong enough to force them to face the truth, powerful enough to shake the very foundation they were so proud of. I took a deep breath and closed my eyes for a few seconds. When I opened them again, the weakness was gone. What remained was absolute calm, the kind of calm that belongs to someone who has decided to flip the board entirely. Quietly, I pulled out my phone. My fingers trembled slightly, but my gaze was colder than ever. In a room filled with mocking laughter and arrogant boasts, no one noticed that small movement. To them, I was irrelevant, not important enough to watch. And that underestimation gave me the ultimate advantage. I opened my conversation with my investment manager, staring at the familiar name on the screen. After another steady breath, I typed carefully, "Withdraw all funding from Anderson Holdings, immediately." The message was sent in seconds. But the shockwave it would trigger would last far longer. I locked my screen and placed the phone down, the faintest smile curving on my lips. None of them knew that with a single command, I had just touched the lifeline of the empire they were so proud of. The cash flow, the preferential loans, the quietly arranged guarantee funds, all of it was tied to that decision. And once it was cut, the domino effect would begin. My father was still passionately talking about the major deal that was about to be signed. My mother kept checking the time, reminding everyone that the board meeting was only minutes away. They had no idea that the very meeting they were anticipating would soon become the worst nightmare of their careers. I sat quietly, listening, my heartbeat sinking with the ticking of the clock. With every passing second, the gears of fate turned faster. In my mind, I could already see it clearly. The panic on their faces when they discovered the funding had suddenly vanished, the flood of frantic phone calls, the questions with no answers. And when the truth finally surfaced, they would be forced to confront what they had always denied, that the one they had underestimated the most was the very person holding the power to decide their survival. If you want to know what happens next, comment 1 right now so you don't miss the most intense climax. Less than 10 minutes later, the atmosphere inside the house shifted completely. Phones began ringing one after another, slicing through the unfinished conversation. My father's expression changed from confident to confused, then drained of color as he stared at the screen. My mother froze, her lips pressing tightly together, her eyes revealing a worry she could no longer hide. The calls kept coming, not giving them a single second to breathe. Quick glances, deepening frowns, tightened jaws. Everything signaled that something was terribly wrong. "What's going on?" someone in the family asked. No one answered. My father abruptly stood up and stepped out onto the balcony to take a call, his voice noticeably lower, heavier. I remained seated, fingers intertwined, calmly observing every subtle shift in expression. The pieces were locking into place, and the picture of collapse was beginning to reveal itself. Within minutes, the arrogance that once filled the room had evaporated, replaced by a suffocating tension thick enough to choke on. My mother kept refreshing her email on the tablet, scrolling through each line at a frantic pace. Suddenly, she let out a faint gasp, as if she had just read something impossible to believe. The expansion plans, the contracts, waiting for disbursement, all of them were suddenly suspended. The cash flow had stopped without warning, dragging along a chain of consequences they had never anticipated. An emergency board meeting was called immediately. The driver was summoned at once. No one had the energy left to mock or belittle me. Instead, a few glances began shifting in my direction, uncertain, suspicious. It was as if they could sense that an invisible hand had quietly turned the tide. I stood up, adjusted my coat, and walked toward the door with composed steps. Inside me, a storm was raging. On the outside, there was only cold restraint. The game had entered its second round. And this time, I was the one in control. The boardroom was suffocated by a heaviness unlike anything before. Faces that once radiated confidence and pride now showed unmistakable strain. The finance directors whispered urgently among themselves, flipping through thick stacks of documents. On the large screen, glaring red numbers flashed like a stern warning. The primary funding stream had been abruptly withdrawn. Preferential loans were instantly frozen. Critical payment chains were beginning to tremble. My father sat at the head of the table, his hands tightly clasped together. Sweat formed on his forehead despite the air conditioner running at full blast. He kept firing off sharp questions, his tone growing harsher by the minute, but the answers he received were nothing but hesitation and silence. My mother sat beside him, lips pressed thin, her gaze flickering between panic and fury. Her fingers tapped relentlessly against the table, as if trying to push away the rising sense of dread that was tightening its grip with every passing second. The debate quickly spiraled into chaos. One person blamed the market, another questioned their partners. Someone urgently suggested liquidating assets to stabilize cash flow. But deep down, they all understood the same thing. If they couldn't identify where the missing capital had gone, every solution was nothing more than a temporary patch. The tension in the room was so thick that even the sound of breathing felt amplified. Then, a young financial assistant stood up, visibly trembling, her voice unsteady. She presented the latest report. The primary investment fund had officially withdrawn all capital and revoked its guarantee commitments. The room fell silent. All eyes turned to the screen, where the legal entity behind that fund was displayed. A name they had never valued, never paid attention to, a name they had always dismissed. In that instant, I knew the curtain was about to be pulled back. And when the truth surfaced, it wouldn't just be a financial empire that trembled, my family's pride would begin to collapse with it. The boardroom sank into a deathly silence as the name on the screen became unmistakably clear. No more whispers. No more excuses. Only stunned expressions and heavy breaths. My father froze. His pupils tightened, as if he had just seen a familiar ghost. My mother let out a faint gasp, her hand trembling as it gripped the edge of her chair. Several board members exchanged looks of absolute disbelief. "That's impossible," someone muttered. But the truth stood right there, cold and merciless. The legal entity behind the primary investment fund, the one with the authority to pull every dollar of lifeblood from the company, was me. The child they had underestimated. The one they mocked as not capable enough. Now every piece fit perfectly into place, exposing the blindness they had carried for years. The air in the room seemed to freeze. My father shot to his feet, his voice breaking. It was you?" The question came out weak, carrying both horror and belated regret. I didn't answer right away. I simply rose slowly, my calm gaze sweeping across each face in the room. In that moment, every past insult, every trace of contempt, became meaningless. "Everything I offered this morning wasn't a plea," I said evenly, each word landing like a hammer strike. "It was your last opportunity." The entire room fell silent. My mother covered her face, her breathing quick and uneven. Those who had once been arrogant now lowered their heads, unable to meet my eyes. I turned and walked out of the boardroom, leaving behind a trembling empire and a family forced to confront a bitter truth. If you want to know what they'll do next, and whether I'll step in to save them, comment 1 right now to follow the most intense climax. The boardroom door closed behind me, sealing in an atmosphere heavy enough to suffocate. My footsteps echoed down the long corridor, steady and measured, yet inside me a storm of conflicting emotions churned. It wasn't triumph. It wasn't satisfaction. It was an emptiness I couldn't quite name. I had once longed for recognition, wished, just once, to be seen as a true part of the family. But when it finally came in the cruelest way possible, I didn't feel the relief I had imagined. I stood before the floor-to-ceiling glass window, looking down at the city below. Streams of cars pushed through crowded streets. People hurried along the sidewalks. Everything continued as if no earthquake had just shaken the ground beneath our world. Only they and I knew that something irreversible had shifted. A light gust of wind brushed past, carrying a sharp chill that made me shiver. In that moment, I realized something unsettling. Power does not bring peace. It only exposes the cracks that have existed for far longer than anyone dared to admit. My phone began vibrating nonstop. Missed calls flooded the screen from my father, my mother, members of the board. I didn't answer. I needed time to hear my own thoughts. Years of endurance, countless swallowed frustrations. All of it came rushing back like a slow-motion film, replaying every quiet humiliation. I found myself asking a question I couldn't avoid. Was I taking revenge? Or simply reclaiming the fairness that had been denied to me? A message appeared from my mother. "I'm sorry. We need to talk." Just one short sentence, yet it was enough to tighten my chest. The familiar pride in her tone was gone, replaced by a vulnerability I had rarely seen. I knew that behind those closed doors, they were confronting the fear of losing everything, not just their wealth, but the image they had built of themselves. I turned off the screen and drew in a long, steady breath. My next decision would not only determine the fate of a corporation, it would redraw the final boundary between my family and me. At last, I stepped into the small room at the end of the hallway, where warm yellow light fell over the faces waiting in silence. My parents sat opposite each other, a heavy space between them as if neither dared to fill it. When I appeared, they both looked up at once. The familiar arrogance in their eyes was gone. What remained was exhaustion, fear, and a trace of pleading I had never seen before. My father broke the silence. He stood up, his voice lower now, stripped of its authority. "What do you want?" It was a simple question, yet weighed down with helplessness. I met his gaze without flinching. "I want the truth," I replied. Why have I always been overlooked all these years? Why were my efforts never acknowledged? My mother began to cry. Tears streamed down her cheeks, blurring the perfection of her makeup. She admitted that from the very beginning, they had believed I was too soft to survive the brutal world of business. They thought keeping me on the outside would protect me from harm. But they had never realized that the exclusion itself was the deepest wound of all. Every word she spoke felt like a dull blade, slowly carving through the memories I had tried so hard to bury. I listened without interrupting. Fragments of memory came rushing back: family parties, where I sat quietly in a corner, major decisions made without my name ever appearing on the list. I realized then that it wasn't hatred that had pushed me aside. It was doubt. They had never believed I was strong enough. And that distorted belief had built a distance that felt impossible to repair. When the room fell silent again, I slowly stood up. "I don't need an apology," I said. "I need real change." Their eyes locked onto mine, filled with uncertainty. I knew that this moment was not the end of anything. It was only the beginning. The air in the room thickened after my words. My parents exchanged a glance before looking back at me, their expressions a mixture of fear and anticipation. They understood that the real change I was demanding would not be simple. It would require them to surrender privileges, habits of control, and the pride that had shaped them for decades. I walked slowly around the table, each step underscoring the seriousness of what I was about to declare. "I won't withdraw the funding permanently," I said, my voice calm but firm. "But from now on, I will oversee all financial control. Every project, every major expense. Nothing moves without my approval." My mother drew in a sharp breath, her fingers tightening around the fabric of her sleeve. My father closed his eyes for a few seconds, as if battling a storm within himself. I continued before they had the chance to interrupt. "The board will be restructured. Key positions must be based on competence, not family ties. And most importantly, I want respect, not because of money, but because I am part of this family." Each sentence landed like a non-negotiable term. Silence stretched across the room. The faint hum of the air conditioner became almost unbearably loud. Finally, my father opened his eyes. The familiar rigidity in his gaze was gone. He gave a slow nod. "If that's the price to keep everything," he said quietly, "then I accept." The words were heavy as stone, but they marked a turning point with no way back. My mother stepped closer, her voice trembling. "I just hope you won't leave this family." I looked at her, a bitter ache rising in my chest. The balance of power had shifted, but the old wounds had not yet healed. I understood then that this agreement was not an ending. It was the beginning of something far more difficult, a path where I would have to learn how to be both a leader and a healer, rebuilding fractures that had been deepening for years. The days that followed moved to an entirely different rhythm. I officially stepped into the center of the machine I had spent years observing from the outside. Back-to-back meetings, stacks of reports, and countless life-or-death decisions forced me to act quickly and decisively. The pressure was immense. But this time, I didn't feel like an outsider. I knew I was exactly where I belonged. My family slowly began to change the way they looked at me. Suspicious glances turned into cautious restraint, and little by little, into respect. My father started asking for my opinion before making major decisions. My mother no longer tried to control everything as she once had. She learned to listen. Family dinners became quieter. The sarcasm faded. The suffocating silences disappeared. It wasn't warmth, not yet, but it carried a rare sense of peace. And still, there was an emptiness inside me. Power can shift circumstances, but it cannot instantly erase old wounds. I learned to accept that. I learned to be patient with myself and with them, because healing takes time, and forgiveness cannot be forced. Sometimes, I stand alone before the glass window, watching the city glow beneath the night sky. I ask myself, if they had listened to me that day, would everything have been different? Then I smile, because that uneven, painful road shaped who I am today: stronger, clearer-minded, and no longer afraid of being underestimated. This story was never just about money or power. It was about reclaiming self-worth and learning how to stand steady amid broken pieces, so you can keep moving forward,